This Christmas, I'm going to tell you the weird story of my relationship with Charles Dickens's heartfelt novella, A Christmas Carol. A Christmas Carol is arguably the most famous Christmas story of all time. And as I say that, I've just remembered that the Nativity exists. Anyway, A Christmas Carol was published 180 years ago, and it remains a timeless tale of family, community, selflessness, putting the good and the needs of others ahead of yourself, all ideals and themes that the Christmas period is supposed to embody. The stamp that this story has left on Western society is enormous. Just the fact that we call curmudgeonly and covetous old people Scrooges is enough to see that. And this also remains a beautifully written story. Dickens had a way with language. He was famous for it, and you can really see that in this. In the humour and the sweetness, and also in the darkness of it. There are some really dark and truly frightening moments in this story. And as I said, I've got a weird relationship with this book, so let me tell you about it. First of all, like a lot of people, I often reread A Christmas Carol around the Christmas period, often on Christmas Eve. That's pretty normal. But it wasn't always the case because, as I've mentioned before, very recently, I grew up in a household without books and without stories. And also, very strangely, as a child, I was terrified of puppets. And for so many people alive today, the first version of A Christmas Carol that so many of us saw, and one that remains so many people's favourite version, is A Muppet Christmas Carol. But I was too afraid to watch it as a kid. I remember being like 7 years old and watching A Muppet Treasure Island and freaking out. So I didn't see Muppet Christmas Carol until I was a teenager, and I got over my fear of puppets. Which means the first time I actually saw the story of A Christmas Carol in its entirety was not the original tale, was not a film adaptation, but was a play. When I was 11 years old, I was in year 7, and we went on a school trip to go see a play version of A Christmas Carol, and it scared the living shit out of me. I have a very vivid memory of Scrooge being alone on stage. The set is his bedroom. There's a big 4-poster bed. It's very, very quiet, and he's sort of milling around, wearing a gown and a cap. He pulls out his bedpan and tips it out of a window, and the audience gives a laugh. I remember that in so much detail. And then he shuffles across the room and he gets into bed. He's lying on one side of the bed and everything goes quiet. He lies there for a good few seconds. The audience just watches him sleep. And then, just as you start to relax and think that maybe the curtain will drop or the scene will turn to black, on the other side of the bed, Marley's ghost jolts up. Like a vampire out of a coffin, like a mummy out of a sarcophagus. Marley's ghost has been lying there in the bed the whole time, and he jolts upright. And 22 years later, I remember that like it was yesterday. That was the first thing about A Christmas Carol that fused itself to my brain. Absolutely terrifying. A year or two later, Christmas rolls around again, and my English teacher shows the class a film version of A Christmas Carol. But it's not A Muppet Christmas Carol, it's some other version, which I did track down not too long ago and watched a few clips of on YouTube. I don't remember how they titled it, but I remember the moment with the Ghost of Christmas Present, where he opens up his robe and stood underneath are 2 children. And the way I describe that does not sound great, but it's truly horrifying, because these are ghostly children, gaunt and white, dead looking. And the ghost explains to Scrooge what these 2 children represent. And it wasn't until I read the story that I found out that this is in the book. It's not in A Muppet Christmas Carol, it's not in a lot of versions, but it's in the book. And I'm going to read it to you in a bit because it's truly horrifying, a brilliant, brilliant moment. So that's my relationship with A Christmas Carol. I saw a play version that terrified me, a film version that terrified me, and when I got to the age of 13, 14, Christmas rolls around yet again, and we're actually told to read it this time. And even though I've mentioned before that the first time I ever took a book home and read it just for pleasure was Northern Lights by Philip Pullman, and it captivated me and turned me into a bookworm, and that's all true, I did come close a year or two before that. when I took A Christmas Carol home and was told to read the first stave. And the series of paragraphs that describe Scrooge, seeing Marley's ghost in the knocker of his door, going inside, going up the stairs, seeing a ghostly hearse be dragged up the stairs by horses, which is a scene that no one ever talks about, and then being in his bedroom and hearing the dragging of chains all the way down in the cellar, the chains scraping across the wooden floor, up the wooden stairs. I could not sleep that night. So once again, A Christmas Carol is just terrifying me. The play, the film, and now the story itself are all chilling me to my bones. I've spent half of my high school life being terrified of A Christmas Carol and just considering it a bone-chilling horror story. But I was so impressed and so engrossed that I came close to actually figuring out that reading for pleasure could be something I would enjoy. But then it took me until Northern Lights to actually properly figure that out. Eventually, I read the full story, I watched A Muppet Christmas Carol, I fell in love with that film. Everyone loves that film. It is perfect, it is wonderful, it is joyous, it is hilarious. And in recent years, people have been talking a lot on the internet about Gonzo's line delivery at the end when he says, "And Tiny Tim, who did not die." That line is also in the book. I just finished rereading it. And that line is in there, delivered in the exact same way, where the word not is in capitals. I'll prove it. Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. So by the time I was at university, I loved A Christmas Carol as much as everyone did. I read the story, I watched the films, I loved A Muppet Christmas Carol the most, and on life went. And here's where the story gets really, really weird. This is the main story right here. I've talked a lot on this channel about the fact that I have lived in many different places around the world. I spent a year living in Shanghai, a year in Seoul, I've lived in Tokyo multiple times, but I never talk about the first place that I lived when I left the UK the first time. When I was 24, myself and Jess, the co-founder of Books and Bow, moved to Abu Dhabi. We only worked there for a few months, and while we were there, we worked at a school. And we had an interesting boss. In the lead up to Christmas, the boss asked me to put on a Christmas play. They stipulated that whatever the play is about, it shouldn't be overtly biblical, overtly Christian. And finding a Christmas story that isn't really biblical is kind of hard, but A Christmas Carol was the first thing that came to mind. It's a story about giving. It's a story inspired by the spirit of Christmas, but it's not overtly biblical. So I picked it. I cleared it with the boss, and I decided to adapt A Muppet Christmas Carol into a stage musical. I watched the film like 5 times in a row, reworked the script, cast the kids in certain roles, and spent like 2 months rehearsing with them. And on the afternoon that the play was due to go on, younger kids are slowly filing in, filling up the audience. The kids that I cast as actors were backstage getting their costumes ready, going over their lines, blah blah blah. And my boss runs up to me and says, "I've just heard that this play has ghosts in it." They knew it was A Christmas Carol. I told them that. And what this tells me is that my boss had never heard of A Christmas Carol. They'd somehow gone through their entire life without ever knowing that A Christmas Carol was a thing. I responded by explaining that there are no actual ghosts in this play, but they were worried that the kids were going to be scared, and I said the ghosts aren't real, they are in fact being played by other children. It was a weird moment, and my boss was very eager to cancel the whole thing, frightened that the children would be scared of the ghosts that don't exist, and were being played by 11-year-olds. I put the play on anyway, and then I quit my job. That's my weird Christmas Carol story. And now whenever I reread A Christmas Carol, I think of that job, I think of that very, very strange day. But A Christmas Carol has gone on to inspire me over and over again. It is 110 pages long, so you can comfortably read it in a day, as I often do on Christmas Eve. Not every Christmas Eve, depends on where I am and what I'm doing, and honestly, if I remember to. But I always watch A Muppet Christmas Carol, and I always read Dickens's original story. There is something about this book that continues to impress me over and over again. Not just in its themes of family and connection and giving and caring, looking after your community, being selfless, all the things that Christmas embodies, all the things that we tell ourselves that Christmas means, but also in the imagination that was poured into it. I'm a big Dickens fan. A lot of people are. I haven't read all of his books, but I've enjoyed every single one that I have read. When I was doing my GCSEs in high school, our teacher at the time got us to read The Signalman, a tiny little ghost story that Dickens wrote, and we even watched a weird film adaptation of it as well. And not too long ago, I just found this in a bookshop for like £2. I was so happy to find this and get a copy of The Signalman for myself, but if you've never read this, it is a truly frightening ghost story, a really, really weird tale. In fact, I need to read this again soon, and I could even do a video on it because this is amazing. But the imagination and creativity that Dickens puts into all of his stories, I think, is best seen in A Christmas Carol, mostly because it's short. And it's also fantastical. You've got Dickens's trademark over-description of everything, but that works so well for Christmas time because you need to be immersed in that Victorian London Christmas vibe. The snow-covered cobblestones, the thick fog, it's all there and it wraps you up and it puts you in a Victorian Christmas space. The crackling of the fireplaces, the scarves that people wrap around their necks. You see it, you feel it, you smell it, you know it all. So intimately. And then comes the weirdness. Then come the spirits. The way that each of the ghosts is described is chilling. The concept of a ghost who did so much bad in his life being wrapped and weighed down by chains and metal boxes is amazing. It's so vivid, it's so easy to understand, but the idea of it in the first place is brilliant. And then there's the fact that this is truly terrifying. It's a really scary story in so many places. I said that the first 3 times I encountered this, as a play, as a film, and then as the original piece of prose, I was so chilled, so terrified. I didn't see it as a heartwarming story, I saw it as something frightening. Here's the moment of the 2 children that I mentioned before, the terrifying moment with the ghost of Christmas Present. "Forgive me if I am not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe, "but I see something strange, and not belonging to yourself, protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?" "It might be a claw, for the flesh there is upon it," was the spirit's sorrowful reply. "Look here." From the foldings of its robe, it brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at its feet and clung upon the outside of its garment. "Oh man, look here, look down here," exclaimed the ghost. They were a boy and girl, yellow, meagre, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate too in their humility. Where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tints, a stale and shriveled hand, like that of age, had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacingly. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade through all the mysteries of wonderful creation has monsters half so horrible and dread. Scrooge stared back appalled. Having them shown to him in this way, he tried to say that they were fine children, but the words choked themselves, rather than be parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude. "Spirit, are they yours?" Scrooge could say no more. "They are man's," said the spirit, looking down upon them, "and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both, and all of their degree, but most of all beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom." Absolutely chilling. Terrifying. That really frightened me when I saw it in the film, and once again whenever I read this and I remember that it is in here. And it's not in the Muppet one. A Christmas Carol is a much more frightening story than we ever remember it being. Unless you read it every single year and remind yourself that there are some really scary moments in it. But the best example of Dickens's creative language with this story is in its opening page. Marley was dead, to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. And then 2 pages later, you get the description of Scrooge, and it's like nothing I've ever read, or at least it was when I first read it, but it continues to be something that I find so charming and kind of titillating in the way that Dickens uses his language. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shrivelled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head, and on his eyebrows and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days, and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. Ah! It's gorgeous! The way that Dickens describes people and places and things, it's all so marvellous. A lot of people don't like the fact that Dickens is so overly descriptive, kind of in a pompous, overblown camp way. But it's entertainment. Dickens's stories were entertainment for the working classes, his own people. In fact, Dickens hated his children because they didn't have enough imagination. He was annoyed that his kids were boring. As they grew up and became adults, they were dull, uninteresting people. He liked flights of fancy. He was a storyteller, and a storyteller who meant to entertain the masses. And he did so with beautiful language, and A Christmas Carol is my favourite example of that. This remains his most famous story, not just because it's a timeless Christmas tale, but because it's perhaps the best example of Dickens's wonderful command of the English language. I could go on and on and on about A Christmas Carol, why I love it, all the details of it that I love. I could read out passage after passage, and I've already indulged myself way too much. But I have a weird and detailed relationship with this book, as I've told you. And I'm sure more weird things related to this story will come up as my life goes on. A Christmas Carol feels like it haunts me. The fact that for so long I thought it was just a scary story that I kept seeing and not reading, and then eventually reading, seeing what it's really all about, what the real legacy of it is, and then putting it on as a teacher and having my boss be too scared of it and not having a clue what A Christmas Carol was. It was all so weird. And beyond all of that, all of the weird encounters with this story that I've had, the tale itself remains something very important to me. The fact that Dickens was a Christian and this is a Christmas story, but it's not overtly Christian, it's not overtly biblical. It is a story that goes beyond religion, beyond dogma, beyond tradition even. It's a story about goodwill and community and looking after your fellow man, being good to one another. I love all of that. I love it so much. As a humanist and a socialist, I believe in putting people first, in looking after each other in the best ways that we can. And I feel all of that when I read A Christmas Carol. And as someone who loves horror and ghost stories, and as someone who loves Christmas, I can't ask for much more. A Christmas Carol is perfect. If you're someone who likes to reread or rewatch versions of A Christmas Carol at Christmas, let me know. And let me know if you have a weird relationship with this or any other story. As I said, it sometimes feels like A Christmas Carol haunts me in the best way possible, so let me know if there are any stories that haunt you. If you want to get me a nice Christmas present, you can support me on Patreon. I'd really, really appreciate your support, and subscribe for books.